Don't forget where you come from. It's this common maxim of wisdom, often stated to those of notoriety and prominence, those who have been fortunate enough to go from poverty to plenty, from insignificance to influence, from small beginnings to big stages. A more than common wish for renowned individuals is that they remember where they came from. And those who do are among the more respected people of prominence. It's almost as if inherent to human nature is this admiration and appreciation for a humble remembrance of humble beginnings. This is why LeBron James is not only in the GOAT conversation when it comes to basketball, but he's also in the conversations about whose character is greatest outside of their profession. LeBron James is a great example of one who has made it, but has never forgotten where he came from. The early years of his life were spent amidst tough times of poverty, fatherlessness even, in Akron, Ohio. And so LeBron has been intentional to help kids of today who are poor and fatherless in Akron, Ohio. He and his family have started what they call the LeBron James Family Foundation. It's an organization that, since its inception in 2004, has opened a school for underprivileged kids, built a literal village for children of homelessness, has opened an entire complex of affordable housing for families on hard times, and continually offers college opportunities for minors of Akron through their scholarship program. And LeBron has a whole lot of respect due to this. All of this, in addition to the fact that he's been faithfully married to the same woman who he met and began dating his junior year in high school. LeBron is a man who has maintained a tie to the roots from which he started. And people respect him because of it. Because inherent to human nature is a sense of admiration for those who don't forget where they came from. But you see, church, the man in our passage from this morning, he does seem to forget where he comes from. If you've been with us at some point in the last few weeks, then you probably know that we're doing this brief series on the life of Gideon. Gideon is a man whose life is recorded in chapters 6 through 8 of the book of Judges. We're in a 6-week sermon series on those chapters, and I've titled this series, Facing Fears and Addressing Anxieties. The reason I gave it this title is because Gideon was a fearful man. His life was marked by fear and anxiety. And these chapters that kind of give a glimpse into his life, they show us how he dealt with these fears and anxieties, as well as how God dealt with him as he did. Gideon starts out very afraid, friends. He and his people are being oppressed by a foreign nation known as Midian. In the beginning, he literally hides from them out of fear of them. And then God comes up, he shows up to him, and he tells Gideon that he wants Gideon to lead an army against the nation of Midian. But because Gideon was afraid, there was a lot of back and forth in the conversation. He was anxious, he felt fearful, he was scared. But with time, he kind of grows to be more courageous, and he finally obeys God's command to take some troops and lead them into this battle. And where we picked up today, the battle is in process. Gideon has led about 300 soldiers to wage war on about 135,000 soldiers. And in a miraculous way of accomplishing the impossible, God is allowing them to win the battle just like he said he would. But when we come to this point in the narrative, friends, the narrative takes somewhat of a pivot. Whereas we've been talking about facing fears and addressing anxieties, now Gideon becomes a model of one who has overcome fear, but goes to the other sinful extreme of pride. And it seems to me that it's all because Gideon forgets where he comes from. He forgets where he started. He forgets that his starting place was one of fear and anxiety and outright desperation for the Lord's help. Gideon seems to have forgotten that even when God shows up to help him, he was so paralyzed by fear that it still took several conversations, it took several signs, several times of reassurance from God before he could finally be free of the fear that had gripped him and his people. He doesn't remember that when he was given this call from God, the reason he doubted he could accomplish it in the first place was because of how weak he and his people were. But worst of all, church, it seems that Gideon has forgotten that all along the way, with each step of his growth in courage, he wasn't taking these steps by himself, but each step was made with the help and aid of God. Gideon seems to have forgotten all of this. I actually want us to notice the difference about this passage from the ones that lead up to it. We've now come through 2 chapters of this narrative on Gideon's life, and in every passage up to this one, there's been this ongoing dialogue. Gideon has been in continual conversation with God, arguably even too much conversation at times. But the very fact that the conversations were happening was evidence that Gideon was aware of his need for God's direction and help as he led God's people. He was aware that he needed God's guidance to act, and that he should only act as God guided him to. But we come to this point in the passage, And in a somewhat abrupt fashion, the dialogue stops. God stops speaking. Action continues, but the conversation does not. I just read a bigger chunk of this narrative than we've covered at any other point in this series, but unlike every other chunk before it, in this one, there's zero communication with God. And I think, church, that this is because what we're now seeing in this passage is a man who's forgetting that he needs God just as desperately as he needed God before. Gideon seems to be forgetting where he came from. He's forgetting that there was this fear that once held him, and he's also forgetting the God who helped him overcome this fear. What we're witnessing, church, is the unfortunate progression of a man who goes from being fearful, anxious, and hesitant to being prideful, reckless, and self-dependent. But you see this passage in here just for us to kind of peek in and shake our condescending heads at Gideon. I think there's something for us to learn from this passage. So as we near the end of this series on fear and anxiety, it'd be our help to consider that the godly antithesis to fear and anxiety is not prideful arrogance and self-dependence, but is instead humble confidence with dependence upon God. I'm going to say that again because y'all seem to be asleep this morning. The godly antithesis to fear and anxiety is not prideful arrogance and self-dependence, but is instead humble confidence with dependence upon God. As a matter of fact, I think we can even pause and recognize that those two words, humble and confident, contrary to what a lot of people believe, they actually do go hand in hand. You can be humble and confident all at the same time. I've even heard it said that humility, true humility, is nothing other than confidence in the proper place. We're humble as God's people because we know we aren't God, but we're also confident as God's people because we know that we've got God on our side. This is the place that Gideon should have gotten to, friends. But instead of going there, he goes to an unhealthy extreme. He skirts past godly confidence and ends up in sinful pride. Verse 24, where we began reading, we saw that he sent messengers to Ephraim. He sent these messengers and he requested they join him in this battle by taking control of the watercourses or the riverbanks that Midian is now fleeing to. And the mere reality that Gideon feels confident to be able to make a request like this, it just shows how much of a pivot there's been since the narrative began. Remember, the reason Gideon and Israel had such a fearful way of living in the first place is because the Midianites, these people that they are now chasing, they'd been bullying and oppressing Israel for 7 years, stealing their food, ruining their homes. 7 years of oppression from Midian had left Israel in this perpetual state of fear. But as we saw last week, in one battle, with a very strange strategy, God has allowed the dynamics to change. And while Gideon and Israel used to be afraid of Midian, Midian is now afraid and fleeing from Gideon. And as verse 22 of chapter 7 told us, it's all because God has allowed this to take place. You can even look back there in your Bibles right quick. Just glance back a few verses. This is showing us, friends, that it's only by the power of God, for the glory of God, that Gideon even has his upper hand on Midian. But Gideon seems to forget that as he goes on this pursuit. Midian is fleeing toward the river because they lived across the Jordan River. Gideon knew that when they fled from him, they'd likely retreat to their homes. They may even want to stop by the river to kind of be refreshed and drink some water along the way. And so he calls for help from another one of Israel's tribes. Gideon is from the tribe of Abiezer. When the battle started, he rallied troops from his own tribe, as well as the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. But there's still other Israelite tribes who haven't been involved in the battle up to this point. One of those tribes was Ephraim. Ephraim is southwest of where the battle starts. Midian is fleeing southeast to their home across the river, and so Gideon sends a messenger to Ephraim telling them to hurry up, gather some troops, assemble an army, and cross the river to cut Midian off whenever they try to go back home. And Ephraim does this successfully. They cut him off. They not only cut him off, but they captured two princes. These would have been two generals of war, leaders of the Midianite people. They captured them, cut their heads off, and brought them back to Gideon across the river. And now you would think that this would be reason for celebration. Like surely Gideon with his army and the army of Ephraim, who just defeated these princes, like they should be happy with what's just happened. God's people are still winning. Oreb and Zeb, who they just killed, were likely some of Midian's best warriors. Like their names even hint at this. Oreb means raven. Zeb means wolf. Those are the kinds of names that you give to people who do raven, wolf-like things. Probably some bad soldiers in this military, and the army of God's people have just captured and killed them. And then they named the places where they killed them, the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. Even that is a textual hint that this should make Gideon rejoice. Think back to chapter 6. Gideon used to hide in wine presses. This whole thing started, he would hide in wine presses. When he first met God, he would worship him at a rock. So the author here is giving us these literary clues that God is allowing for the reversal of what once was in Israel and Gideon's lives, which should lead them to praise, worship, and give thanks in response. But that isn't what happens when Ephraim shows up with the heads of these princes. Why not? Well, it's because instead of looking at God with thanksgiving, these two tribes look at one another with comparison. They look at one another and think, why didn't I get to do that? And friends, by their misstep, we learn a more proper step toward what humble confidence would be. If we want to take steps toward humble confidence, we should be sure to avoid prideful comparison. We should be sure to avoid prideful comparison. Ephraim shows up with the heads of these princes, but instead of rejoicing with Gideon, they want to know why they weren't invited to the fight in the first place. And Gideon, instead of rejoicing with Ephraim, says that it doesn't matter that they weren't invited from the beginning because now they've done more in the fight than he's done. He says, what have I done now compared to you? Is not the gleaning of your tribe better than the harvest of mine? He says, God handed over to you the princes of Midian. What was I able to do compared to you? Verse 1 tells us that this argument they have is a violent argument. It kind of calls to mind what James would later mention in chapter 4 of his epistle. The epistle James wrote in chapter 4, he says that what causes fights among God's people are the passions that wage war within them. And as it was with the Christians of James's day, friends, so it is with the people of God in this passage. The passions that are waging war within don't seem to be passions for the things of God. It seems that they're passions for the things of self. I mean, notice that when Gideon points out how the people of Ephraim have accomplished more, they decided they ain't mad no more. They're okay, cool, you're right. No need to be upset any longer. It's almost as if Gideon, with his guys, and the other guys of Ephraim are in competition over who accomplishes more in this battle. They want to keep tabs on their kills, keep a record of their victories. The problem with this is that when you start to keep these kinds of tabs, you could potentially be growing pride in what you've done. But remember what last week's passage showed us. God wants it to be known that every bit of success achieved in this battle is achieved by his doing. It's God's doing. It's not Gideon. It's not Israel. It's not Ephraim. God wants it to be known, I accomplished the things in this battle. There's this common practice among modern soldiers, soldiers and warriors who fight today. They keep a literal tally of the number of enemy kills they have. Military pilots, for every human plane they shoot down, they'll add stickers to the outside of their planes. Ground soldiers, sometimes they'll count the number of enemies they've taken out and they carve notches onto the barrels of their rifles. Naval ships, they'll often scoop up pieces of enemy ships that they destroy and display them at different places on the decks of their ship. And with each of these added stickers or notches or added pieces of plunder, it's like adding to a badge of honor that says, look what I've accomplished. And in this passage, friends, it seems that Gideon wants a bigger badge than the tribe of Ephraim. But catch this, it's not just Gideon. Who do you want your badge to be bigger than? It's in just for Gideon. Who do you find yourself in sinful comparison against? You ever find yourself at those prideful places of comparing yourself to someone else? I could do that job. Why did they get that opportunity? Why do they have that platform and influence? Why did he get the promotion instead of me? Why did he ask for her number instead of mine? Those kinds of questions don't lead down the road of humble confidence, friends. Questions like these are steps taken on a walk of prideful comparison. The thing to do when God gives you some kind of victory or deliverance isn't to compare the victory or deliverance to the victory or deliverance of someone else. The thing to do is to give God thanks for what he's given both to you and to them. Gideon has been delivered from his paralyzing fears. Like God has given him success in this fight against Midian. But he's like, no. If I'm going to really feel delivered and like extra successful, I got to be more deliberate and victorious and successful than everybody else. This isn't concern with the things of God, friends. This is concern with the things of self. He's taking this mission from God and turning it into a mission for Gideon. And you know what the worst part about when we do this kind of thing is, church? This is essentially us telling God that what he gave us ain't good enough. It's us saying to God, like, your plans, your purposes, your provisions for me, they're not sufficient. I want what you gave them. It's us saying to God, like, your aim for my life ain't it. I want the aim that you have for their life. Let me just tell you this morning, church, God always knows what's best. His aim for our lives is always better than any aim we could have come up with. And so we ought to walk the road of humble confidence by avoiding prideful comparison. And another step we can take toward humble confidence is to avoid prideful motivation. After this conversation with the people of Ephraim, Gideon and his troops move on. They continue pursuing Midian, and they eventually cross over the Jordan River behind them. And the text tells us that they were exhausted, but still in pursuit. I point this out for us to note that in their exhaustion, they continue to pursue, but they still don't pause for any conversation with God. Still no dialogue with the Lord himself. It seems as if it would have been a good time to do that. Like Midian is fleeing. Two of their commanders, 2 princes, have been captured and killed. It seems as if it could have been a good time to pause and get direction from God about what to do next. But Gideon doesn't do that because he's not satisfied with the princes, especially because he wasn't the one that killed them. Gideon wants to go and get the kings of Midian. We know this because of what he says in verse 5 when he encounters the men of Sukkoth. Now, it's important for us to note that these men of Sukkoth, the text talks about them, they're people from another tribe of Israel. God's people is split into 12 different tribes, spread out in 12 different areas at this time. And the people of Sukkoth are those whose lineage traces back to the tribe of Gad. They lived across the Jordan River in one of the cities that was closest to the territory of the Midianites. And so this is one of the tribes of God's people. They're Gideon's kinfolk. They live across the river in the city of Sukkoth. And when Gideon shows up, he and his men are exhausted from their pursuit of Midian's kings. And so naturally, he assumes that his kinfolk, his fellow Israelites, they're going to provide some nourishment so that he might be refreshed in order to continue the pursuit. And so Gideon shows up. He's like, yo, we're tired. Could you please give us some bread so that we can continue in this pursuit? And the men of Sukkoth, they're like, nah. And now people get into different speculations and debates and stuff about the reason they say no. When they ask whether Zebah and Zalmunna are already captured by Gideon, it could be them being prideful themselves and essentially saying, like, you've not done anything to prove that you're worthy of us giving you bread. Or it could have been them saying no out of fear. They live closest to Midian, so if they give this bread to Gideon and his troops, Midian might retaliate against them, and they might not have any backup across the river. And so it could be pride, it could be fear, it could be just because there's division among the different tribes, but something leads the Sukkoth men to tell Gideon no. And so in response, Gideon's like, okay, y'all don't want to give us no bread? Wait till I get back. He says, hold that thought and wait a minute. I'll be back, and when I get back, I'm going to tear your flesh with briars. He threatens his fellow Israelites because they won't help him by providing any bread. And this doesn't happen just once. He moves on to a second city, the city of Penuel, another city where Israelite tribes are living. He asks those brothers for some bread. They say the same thing the men of Sukkoth said, and so Gideon tells them, when I come back, I'm going to tear your defense tower down. And so twice now, Gideon has issued threats to other tribes of God's people, and it's not because God tells him to. It's because he himself feels disrespected. He's being driven by selfish motivations, friends. Like, notice how he speaks in these verses. Please give some bread to the troops under my command, for they're exhausted, for I am pursuing the kings of Midian. That to me just reads with a tone of self-centered motivation. Give us some bread so that I can carry on with this grand assignment that I'm on. And then he doubles down on this self-centeredness and pride when he responds to his Israelite brothers in the way that he does. And here's the real problem, friends. Here's where Gideon is really falling short in his realization. God's primary aim in all of this was not that Israel would overcome Midian solely for the sake of victory in battle. God's aim from the very beginning of this narrative, the whole reason he raised Gideon up for him to be a leader of his people in the first place, was so that the people could overcome not just Midian, but the sinful ways of Midian. Midian has oppressed Israel, but they also had influenced Israel. Israel had adopted the sinful idolatry and worship of false gods that they were known for. And the Lord's intent is to do away with Midian so that Israel would no longer be oppressed, but even more significantly, so that Israel would no longer be lost in sin and idolatry. So this isn't just about victory in battle. This is about victory in heart, soul, life, and faith. And I bring this to mind for this reason. If Gideon had kept God's aim in mind, he wouldn't have threatened God's people. The proper response, friends, was not to be beating people with briars and tearing down towers. No. Gideon should have responded to his brothers by appealing to them that they should join in fighting for the Lord's purposes. He should have told them, like brothers, God is delivering us from sin. He's helping us overcome Midian. So we get to return to proper fellowship with God, our Father. He should have told, join me in the fight, not for my sake, not just because I'm hungry and I want some bread, but join me in this fight because it's the Lord's fight. God's purposes, friends, should have been the thing to appeal to God's people. But Gideon doesn't go there in his mind because this fight to him has become more about his own purposes. He's concerned with his will, the things that he wants, instead of the purposes of God. His concern with capturing these kings seemed to be more about his own reputation than it is about Israel's sanctification. Like God has helped him overcome fear and grow in courage, but he seems to have forgotten God's purposes for these things. And I want to make 2 points of application on this. The first one is this. We should never convince ourselves that the growth and deliverance God gives us is to make a big deal about us instead of God. Our growth in any area, beloved, is for the sake of us better fulfilling God's purposes for us and better testifying of God's work in us. Our growth is first and foremost for God's glory. The second thing I want to say, when we're dealing with God's people, our brothers and sisters, like when we're walking together in relationship, even as a church, if someone isn't acting in the faith and obedience that God calls us to, our initial offer to them should be gospel grace, not condescending cockiness. I recently read that the definition of patience could be that it's the refusal to make someone move at our pace. And when it comes to walking together for the purposes of God, church, we ought to be patient with one another as God is patient with us. But this isn't how we move when we're driven by selfish motivations. Selfish motivation leads us on a mission for the sake of our own name. And that's exactly where Gideon seems to be. He's on a mission for his name's sake. He's after blood for his own fulfillment. Verses 10 through 12 tell us that he finds the kings that he's hunting down. He finds them in another location. He sneaks up on them, and he captures them when they least expect it. And then look at what he does when he captures them. Verse 13. He goes back to his own people, those that didn't give him any bread. He captures one of their youth. He forces the youth to tell him who the tribal leaders were. And then he captures all of them and gives them what sounds like, for lack of a better word, a really bad spanking. Like you can't make this. I love that the Bible is so plain at times. Like some of y'all might have grown up with grandparents or parents who used to send you to get what they call a switch when you were in trouble. You can probably envision what this was like then. If you don't, ask me later. I'll tell you after church what a switch was. But you can probably envision what this is like. It says he got some briars and he disciplined these men. It's a form of humiliation. This ancient tactic to publicly humiliate an enemy, same as what's happening when he kills the people and tears down the defense tower in Peniel. He's humiliating them by making them appear to be defenseless. But again, church, the problem here is that these are his brothers. He humiliates them and even kills them, his own brothers, fellow people of God. Like Gideon should have never even thought to do something like this. By humiliating the people of God in this way, Gideon is actually simultaneously defaming the name of God himself. But he does it because he's motivated by pride, frustrated by his own lack of being respected, defensive over his own reputation. Pastor Brogan read a book last year. I think it's entitled The Untangling of Emotions. Untangling Emotions. Untangling Emotions. That one, the second one. Untangling Emotions. Pastor Brogan read this book last year, and he was telling me about how in the book there's this kind of series of questions that you can ask yourself when you get to a point of frustration. The questions are, in my anger, or when you get to a point of frustration or anger, I guess. But the questions go, in my anger, what is the wrong I'm perceiving? Second one, what does my anger show that I value? Third one, what am I trying to defend in my anger? And then lastly, how can I slow down in my anger? So what am I perceiving is wrong? What does my anger show that I value? What am I trying to defend? And how can I slow down in my anger? Gideon would have been helped to have these kinds of questions to ask himself. He was motivated by pride and selfishness. These kinds of questions can help put that kind of motivation in check. He didn't have them to ask of himself, but by God's grace, church, because of Pastor Brogan reading the book, we now all do. And so let's be a people who resist angry, proudful motivation by asking good questions that get to the root of what we're being motivated by. Be humbly confident by avoiding prideful motivation. And then lastly, be humbly confident by avoiding prideful aspiration. After Gideon wrongfully deals with his own kin, he moves on. And he's finally going to deal with the kings of Midian. And he kind of draws this out by asking some questions. Apparently, Midian had killed some of Gideon's tribe at a place called Mount Tabor. He asked them about this. They owned up to it. And in a way of sarcastic flattery, they tell Gideon that the men they killed were evidently people of his tribe. He says that they look like him, and they look like they were sons of kings, they say. And I don't think they're complimenting Gideon here. I think that they're kind of insulting him with sarcasm. But I think the author includes this detail because it gives us a glimpse into what's actually going on beneath the surface of Gideon's heart. going to become more clear in next week's passage. I don't want to steal the thunder from it. But I think we can all see, even from today's passage, that Gideon wants to establish himself as a kind of a powerful, strong, kingly ruler in Israel. The kings of Midian could see it, and the next thing Gideon does makes it even more clear. He tells his oldest son in verse 20 to get up and kill these kings of Midian. And now, Gideon doesn't tell his son this solely because he wants the kings dead. The reason he tells him this is because in his pride, he's trying to establish a king-like legacy. He knows that if his oldest son kills foreign kings, it further establishes his influence and his legacy among the people, because then it isn't just him who's a great warrior, but even his sons who come after him are great warriors. He'd have an heir to this imaginary throne that he's creating in his mind. It's a powerful aspiration that he tries to achieve through the command he gives his son. Unfortunately for him, his son wouldn't do it. He was afraid. And I think the fear his son displays is actually meant to give us a kind of comparative flashback to what Gideon used to be like. Remember, he was once a fearful, anxious man, just like his son is. That wasn't good. Now he's forgotten where he started, and he's grown to be this proudful, reckless warrior, and that ain't good either. He has missed the more healthy, proper place of humble confidence and reliance upon God. And I just want to say this. The place Gideon misses, church, is the place we all need to find. We ought not be motivated and driven by powerful aspirations. We shouldn't live to leave a legacy that brings glory to us. Our aim and purpose in all of life should be to glorify God and to leave this gospel legacy by which God saves his people. And now listen, this isn't me saying that you should settle for mediocrity or choose to be less than your potential or avoid growth and never attempt to become strong. Like I told y'all before, you ain't got the kind of pastor who's going to say that kind of stuff. But what I will say is this: be great, be a boss, be a stud, have courage, do whatever you want to call it. Be all of those things. Be all you can be, but be it all for God's glory, friends. Because listen to me, God's name and fame is the only name and fame that's going to live forever anyways. His is the only one that's going to last forever. Every person who's ever lived, all these people who have had fame, like we write books about them, we build monuments in their honor, even these days we follow them on social media, all that stuff is going to perish in the end, church. And when we get to heaven, there's going to be one throne. And everybody else around is going to bow in worship and adoration at that one throne. And so take a note from the flawed ways of Gideon and start now. Leverage any greatness you got for the great name of our great God. Because it's not in your greatness that you'll be fulfilled. It's not in your wisdom that you'll feel enlightened. It's not in your righteousness that you'll find salvation. It's not in your legacy that you'll become everlasting. It's not in your fame that you'll be pleased. And hear me on this. I actually want to argue with Zeba and Zalmunna when I say this one. It's not by your strength that you will be judged. Zeba and Zalmunna tell Gideon that line in verse 21. And Gideon gets up and kills them to show that he is strong. A man is judged by his strength, they say. Like, get up and strike us down yourself, for a man is judged by his strength. What they say here hasn't been true since the beginning of time, and it won't be true between now and the end of time. You know what a man is judged by, church? Not by his strength, but by his faith in the God who has all strength. The irony of this whole narrative, friends, is that in his heart, Gideon wants to be remembered for his strength. Like he wants to be remembered as this powerful ruler and leader of God's people. And he does end up being remembered, but it ain't because he was strong. Gideon's name is mentioned in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. I'm actually going to read it for us. As the author of Hebrews writes, he goes on this long tangent where he names several folks who had lived before him, and he calls them examples of people who God did great things through because of their faith. And in Hebrews 11, verse 32, we read this. What more can I say, the author says? Time is too short for me to tell about Gideon, first one named. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets who, by faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight. I'm going to skip to verse 39. All these were approved through their faith. So Gideon was remembered. Even some of the stuff he did was remembered. But when the author of Hebrews writes about him, they make sure to mention that all he did by faith. It goes to say, church, that nothing he did because he was strong. It was all because the God he had faith in was strong. And I'm going to close by saying this today. The beauty of the Christian gospel is that weak people are given eternal life and legacy through faith in a strong God. What we all need for everlasting life and legacy is not victory in any physical battle. We need victory in the spiritual battle we fight against sin. And just like Gideon, we don't have the strength to win this battle on our own, friends. And so just like with Gideon, God has provided the strength that is needed. He sent his strong son, Jesus. Jesus was strong enough to live perfectly and to resist all temptation to sin. He was strong enough to die sacrificially for the sins of man. And he was strong enough to victoriously rise to new life for the everlasting hope of man. In his strength, he has beat for us what was unbeatable apart from him. And all God asks of us in return, all God asks us to do to partake in his victory, is that we come to him in humble confidence. Humble recognition that we're sinners in need of salvation. Confident belief that Christ is strong enough to give it. The starting place for us all, friends, is under the oppression of our sin, but by the strength of our great God and no strength of our own, we can end up as victorious overcomers. Just don't forget where you come from. Let's pray.